Tucked away under a layer of dust lies a stack of handwritten papers, a century old. They're disheveled, out of order, their thin corners curling up with age. Some might call them trash. But to Sue Burns, this seemingly worthless bundle of dust is a treasure, an entire life just waiting to be told. Sifting through the now disintegrating pages, Sue pauses, running her finger across one line in particular. The words faded and smeared with age, it reads, "It is but a common life." And perhaps it was. After all, you've probably never heard of the woman who wrote those words. But did you know, even common lives have a tendency to be extraordinary? Let's fix that. Hello, I'm Shay LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. This episode kicks off Women's History Month here in the US, and it's going to be a little different than a typical episode. Yes, I always try to find lesser-known stories to share with you rather than rehash things you've already heard a million times. But this one is on a different level of lesser known. This is the story of an ordinary person, someone you've probably never heard of, a woman living in a particular time and place, a woman who went to great lengths to record history as it was happening to her. A common life, she called it. But I think you'll find it was anything but. And this is a big deal, this voice, this window into the life of someone living over 100 years ago, most notably because she was a woman. I've talked about this before, how hard it is to research historical women. Their stories so often went unrecorded, and their achievements, although great, were typically behind the scenes. They're not the action stars of history. They are the crew, the cameraman, the writer, the director, the army behind the scenes, making it all happen. But that part isn't in the movie. You don't even think about it when you're watching the movie. And that's women's history. When we do find some shred of evidence, something written down, it's usually through the voice of a man, tainted somewhat by a male perspective. Think about Pocahontas and how much John Smith chose to butcher her story. Think about the wives of Henry VIII, the twisted lens through which history has cast them. Think about Ada Lovelace, if she had had her own voice, if her story wasn't completely dampened by the men who dominated the computer science field, how much sooner would that technology have been available? Think about Hazel Scott and the way the all-male panel on the House Un-American Activities Committee chose to erase her from history completely because they could, because they controlled the narrative. And think about Lisa del Giocondo, the Mona Lisa, whom we know almost nothing about, save for her face, painted by a man. So when I came across this book, A Common Life, A Voice from the Progressive Era, and I learned the story behind it, how it all came about, I had to know more. I'm in a Facebook group for finding podcast guests. I don't get on there very often, but, looking for someone who's cut open a dead body for the Body Snatchers episode, that's pretty niche. And thank you, Dr. Jeff Sankoff, for responding to my post. I also reached out to try to find someone in the genetics or fertility world willing to talk about eugenics, but it was crickets on that one. Anyway, I stumbled upon a post recently by a woman named Sue E. Burns that read, quote, "I'm Sue. My great-great-grandmother kept a diary from 1888 until she died in 1922 at age 79. I took her words and did a deep dive into the story behind what she wrote to create context for her diary entries. Her first-person account of her life provides a front-row seat to the pivotal time in history known as the Progressive Era. Her diary provides insights into her personal experiences during World War I, diagnosis and treatment of diseases in a pre-antibiotic era, the skills she needed to provide for herself and manage her farm after her husband died, and all the day-to-day activities required by her life. I routinely give presentations and interviews about her diary, my research into it, and the book I published that pulls it all together. And I was like, yes, me, pick me. So I sat down to chat with Sue about her great great grandmother's story and the book she wrote about it, A Common Life, A Voice from the Progressive Era. And in honor of preserving women's history, I'd like to share that with you today.
My name is Sue Burns. I'm retired. For 30 years, I was a IT support person for an organization, which is kind of where I learned my research and analytical skills that I used a lot in writing my book. I currently live in Iowa, and I'm a lifelong Iowan. I grew up on a farm in central Iowa, and that's part of my connection to the book as well.
I understand that you came upon a diary, and I would love to know whose diary was that and how did you acquire it?
Well, it wasn't me personally who acquired the diary. In fact, there's a whole chapter in the book about how the diary came to become the book. But back in the probably mid to late 90s, somebody was cleaning out an attic and found the diary. And as soon as the diary was removed from the attic, the pages started to disintegrate. And somehow my mom heard about this, and she was really concerned that the words that were on the pages not get lost. And so I was out visiting her one time, and she was telling me about this project, this diary that somebody had found, and she was trying to transcribe the diary with her electric typewriter. And and I offered to help her with it. I'm like, Mom, there's got to be a better way. So we started working together to try and get the diary digitized, and we tried a bunch of stuff, but we ended up, I used an OCR program, optical character recognition. I was not optimistic because I didn't think it was going to work very well on handwritten text, but it didn't work too badly. And we ended up that, I would look through the text file that was created as Mom was reading out loud, and we would try and catch artifacts and things that got messed up. Um, so that's how we ended up actually just digitizing the diary. And that was probably, we finished that project 1999 or something like that. And then the diary just sat there for probably a couple of decades. I always thought that, God, there's got to be somebody who would be interested in this diary. And a friend of mine told me about an organization called the Iowa Women's Archive, which is an organization related to the Iowa City Library. I was University of Iowa Library, sorry. Um, and I donated a copy of the diary to this archive. And in delivering the diary, I was talking to the curators about it, and they were really excited about this diary because they didn't have anything in their collection that went back that far. Because the diary starts in 1888. They said they had a lot of diaries from, World War II and a few prior to that, but nothing that went back to 1888. So they were really excited about that. They were also really excited because Mary, the woman who wrote the diary, actually wrote a lot of diaries that they had. It would be warmer today, or it rained last night, and that was it. And she actually wrote. So they were really excited about it. The woman who wrote the diary is Mary Anne Mosher Briggs. She's my great great grandmother. She was born in 1842 and died in 1922. So the diary covers the years from 1888 until she died in 1922. And she lived most of her life on a farm in central Iowa.
Wow, it's really I've researched or attempted to at least research quite a few women for my podcast, and I always find it really difficult because so many of their stories just were not written down or they were recorded through like a male perspective. So it's really fascinating that she actually recorded so much about her life. And like you said, it's not just like the weather, like she's actually writing down things that, kind of a window into that time. So you said, so she was born in the 1840s. So she was around like in her 40s when she started the diary. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It's I think she was 45 when she started the diary. I could do the math, but that's sort of the
Right.
number that sticks in my head.
Close enough.
Yeah, because she'd been married for 18 years at
Okay.
that point. In fact, the very first entry in the diary kind of sounds like an introduction. It's January 1st of 1888, and she's like introducing her life and herself, and it just sounds like this is the first entry and this is the start. And then there's like an 11-year gap in the diary where there are no entries, or there were and they've been lost, because we're not entirely sure that we've actually
Mm.
got all of the entries that she wrote. So there's like an 11-year gap, and then around the late 1890s, it kind of starts up again, and then she really keeps with it pretty regularly until she dies.
Was this all like in one book, like one notebook, or was it like multiple different documents and pages and books that she was recording in?
She tended to write on um, tablet paper. And
Okay.
I don't know if you're old enough to remember Big Chief tablets.
Mm,
I remember them from
yeah.
when I was in early elementary. But that's what she wrote on. And I don't know that it's Big Chief brand, but that's what they look like when we saw them. So it's just cheap newsprint paper,
Right, okay.
unlined paper, tablet kind of thing.
That very like thin sort of paper that,
Well, yeah, and just cheap paper. I mean,
yeah.
it's no wonder it started to disintegrate as soon as it came out of the attic. Um, but a lot of the sheets had come loose, so we had a whole bunch of just individual sheets. That was a lot of the project that my mom and I worked on, was just trying to figure out what order these pages go in, because she would put the day, I mean, the number of the day, and then she would write an entry. But she would only put the month on the first of the month, and she only put the year on the first of the year.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's like we have all these pages with just numbers on them. And it's like we had to try and figure out what year they went with, what month they went with. Um, the mom and I did the best we could, but as I started doing the research for the book, I realized that, oh, wait, no, that can't be here. That has to be in a different year. And
Right.
so then I went back and started doing some reorganization from what mom and I originally did, just because I knew more about what was going on at the time and the things that she was writing.
Right. To make it make sense chronologically, that's like a huge puzzle,
Yes.
really. Wow. Yeah, because I'm picturing like a book where it's all just neatly in order, but wow, that was
No, no, it wasn't that easy.
oh my goodness. Well, let's talk a little about her story. I mean, that's a lot of years of recording. I'm sure there's a lot there. Are there any particular events or moments from her life that you would like to share?
Oh wow, there were so many of them. Because it does cover a lot of years. What I ended up doing with the book was, instead of organizing it chronologically across her life, I took the things that she wrote about a lot, 'cause she would write about things over and over again as they occurred in her life, and I would put them into themes. So if that was a theme, and then each one of those themes is a chapter, and then within that chapter, all of the entries are chronological, um, and that really helped me kind of see patterns in these themes. Like, for example, she wrote a lot about what she was reading, and I really liked being able to watch what she was reading change and grow across her life. And it's like looking at everything that she read as a whole. It was a lot more interesting than just, okay, in 1906 she read this book, and in 1912 she read this book, kind of thing. Um, but there were so many surprises, things that she would write about something, and I would start doing the research on it, and I sometimes had absolutely no idea where I was going to end up when I started researching something. I think probably the biggest surprise for me, the one that I just got so excited about when I found, her daughter Lily got married in 1906, and she and her husband moved to South Dakota, where they homesteaded some land up there. They had two kids. And then in 1913, Lily and the two kids move back to Iowa and move in with Mary. And I'm like, well, what happened to the husband? And I just kind of assumed, well, maybe he died and it was in a section of the diary that's lost, or just wasn't mentioned, or whatever. But I kept digging, and I did eventually find him. And I found that he had been committed to a mental hospital
Oh,
where he
wow.
spent the rest of his life.
Wow.
And then I found his medical records at the hospital and figured out, okay, well, what put him there? How did he end up there? What was his life like after this point? What was Lily's life like after this point? That turned into a much, much bigger story than I ever expected it would. Um, but I was just so excited when I was like, I found him.
Yeah, that's very unexpected. That's probably not at all what you were thinking you would uncover.
Yeah, at first I didn't even know where to look, you
Mhm.
know, and but yeah, that was probably one of the bigger stories that I just didn't expect as I was doing the research on the diary.
And though I know you mentioned that Mary's husband also passed away at some point, and was that you said pretty early on in her writing the diary, or was she older when he died?
Well, he died in 1903.
Okay,
So yeah, it was pretty early in the diary. So she was a widow for almost the entire diary.
right. And how many did she have many children, or just how many children did she have?
She had six,
Okay,
and
yeah.
she had six in the first 8 years they were married.
Wow. Ooh.
So that was one of the things she also wrote about. There's one diary entry where she says something like, "And the children came so fast,"
Yeah, that's a lot.
because she was talking about, managing their schooling and, all of the other tasks that were required for running a farm and running a family and keeping a household going. And she did, because that was one of the things that I noticed as I was looking at like the birth dates of all of her children. And, pretty much every, 16 to 20 months, in the first years of their marriage, she was having another child. And as far as I know, all of them survived.
Wow.
I don't know that there were any miscarriages or children that died, shortly after birth. Um, there are a couple of gaps in the birth order where, maybe there was a miscarriage in there, but I
Right.
don't know, and she certainly wasn't going to say because that's very common for that time period. You never talked about pregnancy, and she
Right.
never ever mentioned pregnancy, even when, she was having grandchildren being born. The most she would say was, "Well, Franny had another boy." That was it.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I discovered is I was looking at Iowa census data, and I think it was for 1880. And one of the things that it said was that almost half of all of the deaths that were recorded for that census period were children under the age of 5. So
Yeah.
it's like just the child mortality rate back then when she was having her, it was really high. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like 1 out of 6 or 7
Yeah, that's really
children would die.
remarkable that hers that so many, that she had so many that survived to adulthood. That's some great genetics there. You're lucky to have.
Well, and she had,
Some good luck. I don't know. I don't know.
yeah, well, she had like 26 grandchildren,
Wow.
and she lost three great grandchildren. One of them died at like 8 months. One of them died at like 5.5 years, and then she had another one that died at about 13. Um, so she did lose some grandchildren, but as far as I know, she didn't lose any um, of her own children.
Mhm.
Her husband was married once before he married her, and his first wife, they had a child, a daughter, and the wife died like a month after the child was born, and then the child died a month later. So he had experienced
Mhm.
that, even if she had.
Mhm. And do you know how he died? Do you know how he ended up dying?
Yeah, actually, there's a whole chapter in the book about that. Um, he, okay, starting in about 1900, there are a lot of entries where, Lem, or LW was her husband's name, Lemuel, um, where he's not doing well. He didn't come to bed. He had to sit up all night. The doctor was called. There were a lot of those kind of entries. And then there was an entry about um, he had some surgery. So there were like two doctors and three men came to the house to perform this surgery. And, surgery was done on the kitchen table kind of thing. And what they ended up doing, she never said this, but I did some research and found out that what had happened in the surgery is they amputated one of his toes.
Oh.
And then a couple of years after that, is when he actually died. In the last couple of years, she doesn't really write a whole lot until after he dies. But he had what was called Bright's disease, which is basically kidney failure.
Okay. Yeah.
So I don't know if between the toe amputation and the kidney failure, if maybe he also had diabetes or
That's what I was
something.
thinking when you said the toe. That was what popped into
Well, and that
my
was
head. Yeah.
when I found out that it was, that he'd had a toe amputated. It's like, oh, that sounds like, diabetes and extremity issues and things like that. And then when I, found his death certificate and found that he had died of Bright's disease, and I figured out that that was kidney failure, it's like, well, that also sounds like diabetes. And there was some other diabetes in the family as well, because the grandchild who died at 5.5, it was diabetes that killed him. So that's that was his story, and apparently the last couple of years of his life were just really painful and awful. In fact, in his obituary, there was a line that said something like, for over 2 years, he'd been prostrated by pain and suffering, and he waited patiently for death to relieve him. And so it just sounds like those last couple years could not have been fun for him or Mary, because they were, his caregivers. I mean, their youngest daughter was also still living with him because she hadn't gotten married yet. So it was Mary and Lily who were taking care of Lem in his final years. But that just had to be a load.
Hmm. So what did that mean for Mary after he passed away? Did they still have this farm? Is she having to take on these responsibilities, or how did her life change after his death?
She did talk about she was having to learn how to manage things and manage money. I suspect she never really goes into this, but I suspect that they had what would be for that time a very traditional type relationship. She took care of the house and the kids, and he took care of the farm, kind of thing. Um, so after he died, yeah, she had to take on those roles. Um, she had four sons, and who some of them were farming in the area as well. So she could contact them, and they kind of helped her, in making decisions and things. But she also owned land in Warren County, because when her parents died, she inherited some land from them. So she was managing property in another county in addition to the farm where she lived. Um, so she was renting out land, and she was, managing the planting and the harvesting. For the most part, I think, especially once she got older, she would just rent out the farmland, and probably didn't have the dairy cattle and the hogs and things that they'd had when she was younger. But yeah, she had to learn how to manage and make do, and she took care of things.
Wow. So we're talking about a pretty large span of time. Were there any sort of major world events or historic moments in history that she happens to mention in the diary or, share some commentary on?
Yeah, well, the progressive era is something that, basically perfectly overlaps the time period of the diary, which is one of the reasons that's why I put it in the title, because it's like, she was just perfectly positioned to talk about the progressive era. And there is one chapter in the book where I look at the progressive era as it relates to her diary, because a lot of the things of the progressive era, it was a rapid technological and sociological, you know, time of change for the country. She talks about like the road in front of her house, which is currently a fairly major highway. At the time was a dirt road. Um, but she talks about the traffic in this road, and you can see over the course of her diary how it changes from strictly animal drawn vehicles to a mix of animal drawn vehicles and cars. And it never quite gets to the point where there are no animal drawn vehicles at all anymore. But that is one of the things, the automobile. That was something that came about kind of in that time period. Um, there was a transition like from steam power to like kerosene, gasoline, diesel kind of power. She has an entry in the diary where she talks about there's a steam plow that they're using to straighten a section of creek in the county. And she makes a trip by train to go see this machine because she just thinks this is so cool. And the thing about that is, if you look on a map, like, Google Maps or Google Earth or something like that, you can see that that stretch of creek is still perfectly straight. And that just does not happen by nature. But that was what this steam plow that she saw did was straighten that section of creek. Um, Wright brothers' first flight was 1903, which she didn't write about herself, but in 1911, which is only 8 years later, she writes about going to see the flying machines. There was this air show that had three pilots. I think two of them were from France, and one of them was a military pilot. And as I was looking at the newspaper coverage of this event, they were just like full page stories and drawings and photos and stuff. It was like an Iowa first. There were three planes in the sky at the same time.
That's very cool. I live a mile away from where the Wright brothers flew the first plane, so that's some local history for me. That's really
Oh,
neat.
cool.
That was part
Yeah.
of the story too. So cool.
Yeah. Well, and then she also the flu pandemic, she lived through that. World War I, she lived through that. Yeah, so there was just that whole time period was just full of major world events. And she talked about there were several like former presidents who had been shot or died just naturally. She talked about world events. There's another chapter in the book for just those kinds of things where she talks about things that are happening in the world outside her farm.
Yeah, that's real. It's so neat to get just like someone's perspective from the time period of those things happening. Because I feel like we look back at them now and it's like you're reading about it in a history book or whatever, but to have like a it's happening right now kind of voice is really interesting. I would love to talk more just kind of about the process of turning it into a book. I know you sort of mentioned some already about having different themes for the chapters and so it's not just like her diary printed as a book. Is it sort of a mix of like excerpts from the diary and your own research, and how did you kind of turn it into a book?
Well, the diary itself, I don't know if you've ever kept a diary or, talked to somebody who keeps a diary. You don't really write for other people if you're writing a diary. And the problem with her diary is she would write things and it's like, it's, who was that? What is that? Why are you writing it? It doesn't really make sense because you don't know what context is. And so that was really my impetus for writing the book because the diary on its own is really, really hard to read just because you don't have the context for everything. So that's why I decided to do the research, figure out that context to make the diary itself a lot more accessible and understandable. So what I did is I took specific entries from the diary and then I just did research into, okay, well, who is she talking about? Why was this important? What was going on at the time? That sort of thing. Like, for example, she wrote that Newton Stanley stopped by for a visit and we talked for an hour. And I'm like, well, who is Newton Stanley? And why did she care? Why did that make it into the diary? So I did a lot of research to try and figure out, well, who is Newton Stanley? And, was he a neighbor? Where did he come from? That sort of thing. For the big world events, it was a lot easier because, there are newspaper articles and things like that. So the book itself is kind of, I took her diary entries and then there's my narration about, okay, this is what she's talking about. This is what this means. And it's not every single entry in the diary. That there's just too much repetition, and there's no real point in, reading every single time that, oh, this is what the crops brought in, or we're harvesting, or we're planting, or, it rained, that sort of thing. Um, so there are some diary entries, and then there's the narration and research that I did that provides the context for those entries.
Were there any particular parts of the diary where that really impacted you, or maybe where Mary had kind of a life lesson or some wisdom that she shared from her time? Anything sort of powerful that you found in there?
Well, the most powerful, I think, or overriding thing about her diary was she had a hard life. I mean, it was just there was a lot of struggle in her life, and she often wrote about, especially after her husband died, she often wrote about being lonely, um, and she spent a lot of time just, waiting for heaven. That was just getting her through. She just wanted to get to heaven. Um, so I almost think that there was some depression going on. Um, which, is kind of understandable. But I think back then there was a real stigma about mental health care. Um, you don't talk about it, you just soldier on kind of thing. And I think that was kind of her attitude as well. Um, and of course, with her son-in-law ending up in a mental institution, you know, it's like those are the two choices. Either you just carry on or you end up in a mental institution. And there really wasn't a lot in between. And, sometimes I just really felt for her. It's like, oh, she just needs somebody to talk to or something. And in a lot of cases, that was her diary, especially in the beginning of the diary. She calls it, dear old journal, or, I can talk to you as I can talk to a friend. And, she refers to her diary as her friend. And I think that was part of her way of processing and coping with her life.
Mm.
Um, there was kind of a change in that around probably 1907, because I think in 1906 she read this book, and it was a book called Stepping Heavenward. It was fiction, but it was written in the form of a diary that follows this girl. When the diary starts, she's 16, and then it follows her through, growing up and getting married and having children and all this sort of thing. And it seems to me like after she read that book, she maybe started thinking of her diary differently.
Mm.
Because before that, she always referred to it as a friend and, companion, that sort of thing. After that, she seems to think of it more as a record of what happened, a record of her life.
Right.
And in fact, there's at one point she writes something about, it's on the order of, you know, people reading these words after the hand that has penned them has ceased its labors, kind of thing. So it's like I think she was kind of thinking that someday somebody else were going to read these words. Yeah. Didn't really affect the way that she wrote because she still didn't explain things.
She probably didn't have much time on her hands to explain things.
Well, and I kind of think when in that first part of the where she starts the diary and then there's nothing for like 11 years, it's like, well, she's got 6 kids under the age of 17. She's managing a household and a farm without electricity, without running water, without, all the stuff that we have now.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine what it took, the hours out of her day that it just took just to keep things running.
Yeah.
And, she just kept going,
Right.
because otherwise it's not going to get done.
Yeah. And I think I read on the back of your book, actually, you had mentioned she wrote something like "It is but a common life." And I find that so interesting because it is, but at the same time, if you really look at it, she's really accomplishing so much, and that's really extraordinary. So it's almost an interest. It's almost ironic to call it a common life and then be
Yeah.
really kind of this very impressive person who's accomplished a lot of behind the scenes things that aren't overtly impressive, but really when you look at all she did and all she overcame in her life, it's pretty extraordinary.
Well, and that's kind of where I started with, and that's also why I named the book A Common Life, because that's how she described her life. But I was kind of initially thinking, it's like, wow, this amazing time in history that she lived, with the Wright brothers' first flight in World War I and all these kinds of things. It's just amazing that she was alive back then. And, the technological changes and things that she saw. And then I got to thinking, well, it's like, well, when I was a kid, a TV was this gigantic piece of furniture that sat in your living room, and it was black and white. And now I've got this device in my pocket where I can watch color movies wherever I want. It's like, okay, that is also a pretty amazing technological advancement. So it kind of made me think, okay, 100 years from now, what would my life look like to somebody else? And that was also what was I was thinking, as I was writing the book, because it's like, yeah, it was an amazing time when we look back on it, but I think, every time period has got its own bit of amazing, history. At some point, it's going to become history.
It's almost like you have to kind of get out of it and look back at it to kind of see how amazing it is. When you're in it, it just feels normal, but
It's just life. Yeah,
yeah,
it's just
yeah,
what it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
You kind of need that like perspective of looking backwards and oh, it's so different from me. But when you're, yeah, that's really neat. Well, it's awesome that she gave us that look into what life was like.
Oh yeah, absolutely. For me, that is what is so special about her diary and the book is it's her words. This is her life that she's talking about. It's a first person account of this period of time. And I think that's pretty cool. Like I said, you need the context to kind of understand some of it, but it's her words, and it's her words more than 100 years later.
So I have to, do you keep a diary of your own life?
I don't keep a daily diary. I kind of keep sort of episodic diaries. Like I have a trip journal. Every time I take a trip someplace, I keep a journal while I'm on the trip. Um, and that basically started back when I was taking, photographs, film photographs, not digital photographs, film photographs. And I'd take all these pictures and I'd get home and I'm like, where was this? What day was this? I don't, I was having trouble, just trying to figure out what was going on with these photographs. And so I was keeping a trip journal so that when I got home, it's like, oh, that was this day and that's what this is. And that helped me kind of organize the photos. But I don't keep a daily journal. And I think about that, and it's like, man, I really should.
I know. I did when I was younger. Like I have like a middle school journal that's probably difficult to go back and read now. But I've stopped. I haven't in a long time. But now this is making me realize like what a really neat thing to do for future generations, just to record the time that you live.
Yeah, and the stuff that you don't think about. I mean, it's like you or I may just take it for granted. Well, that's just the way it works. That's just how life is. But 100 years from now, nobody's going to understand that. Um, and without these kinds of, windows into the past, what you're left with are the official records. It's the newspaper articles. It's, broadcasts. It's that sort of thing that, that's all been filtered through somebody. Whereas journals are these first person, this is real, this is a real life, this is a real experience. And that's really hard to get any other way.
Yeah, yeah. It becomes a game of telephone otherwise, where it's gone through all these voices and everyone's
Exactly.
twisted it a tiny bit. So that like original firsthand account is very special. That's very cool.
That's the part that really, really grabbed me about, the diary itself and writing the book is these are her words and it's a way of preserving her voice, not just for now, but for future generations too. So that there's still that window into that past.
I found myself quite moved by a few of the things Sue shared about Mary. Yes, there were big events, the first flight and World War I, but what moves me even more is the silent struggle she faced that no one got to see. 6 children in 8 years on a farm in rural Iowa without electricity or modern medicine, when you, as the mother, are fully responsible for their upbringing and the management of the whole household. That is a powerful accomplishment. A husband suffering for years, wishing for death while you try your best to comfort him, lift his spirits, while simultaneously taking on his duties, learning how to run a farm, manage finances, still be a mother to your children who are losing their father. That is a powerful accomplishment. Struggling with your own mental health throughout all of it, struggling with depression, just waiting for heaven. At a time when it was taboo to talk openly about mental health. There was no therapy. There was just keep it to yourself or end up in an institution like your son-in-law. Just keep it to yourself and survive. That is a powerful accomplishment. There's nothing common, nothing ordinary about any of that. Mary Anne Mosher Briggs was not an action star, not like Captain John Smith, King Henry VIII, Charles Babbage, or Leonardo da Vinci. Her accomplishments were behind the scenes, off camera. She raised 6 children. She kept them alive, helped shape the people they became, ran the farm that sustained them. And then those 6 children had their own children, passed all of that on to them, and so on and so on. They are us. Mary helped forge the next generations. No, she didn't run a country or paint a famous masterpiece, but her accomplishments through overwhelming struggle, her perseverance, are no less impressive. And the only reason we even know about them is because she chose to write them down. Her own form of therapy. And her great-great-granddaughter, one of the fruits of her labor, chose to preserve them and share them with the world. But there are women everywhere leading these remarkable lives. I'm a firm believer that if women stop doing the things that they have always done, civilization as we know it would absolutely crumble. So in honor of Women's History Month, I'd like to leave you with this. Behind every powerful man throughout time stood an even more powerful woman. His mother, his wife, his daughter, whoever it may be. We don't often get to hear their stories, but rest assured, they were extraordinary. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix, and a huge thank you to Sue for all she has done to share Mary's story. If you're interested in reading A Common Life, A Voice from the Progressive Era by Sue E. Burns, you can find it on Amazon, and I will link that in the description for you. Be sure to follow my Instagram at HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow this podcast on whatever app you're using to listen, and go ahead and share it with a few friends. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.